I am Chloe, 34 years old and a financial forensic investigator. 10 years ago, my brother Marcus orchestrated a lie so devastating that my mother banished me from her life. I spent a decade building an empire from the ashes of that rejection, but last night the silence broke. A frantic midnight call from a neighbor sent me speeding toward Atlanta Medical Center. My mother was in the intensive care unit fighting for her life. When I arrived, I expected to find a family in mourning. Instead, I found Marcus and his wife casually scrolling through designer clothes on their phones outside her room, annoyed that her medical emergency was ruining their evening. They thought I was still the powerless girl they threw away. They had no idea I was about to freeze every single asset they relied on. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to use your own success to stop a toxic family member who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Atlanta, Georgia, our household was a shrine dedicated entirely to my older brother Marcus. To my mother Beatrice, he was the golden child, the brilliant heir to whatever legacy she imagined we had. Meanwhile, I was the scapegoat, the daughter who could never do anything right. The tension reached its breaking point exactly 10 years ago. Marcus had secretly taken out loans against our mother's property to fund a ridiculous business venture that inevitably failed. When the collection agencies started calling, he did not confess. Instead, he fabricated a complex web of lies, pinning the missing funds entirely on me. He forged my signature, manipulated the timeline, and played the role of the devastated son perfectly. My mother believed every single word. She packed my bags and told me I was dead to her. I walked out of that house with absolutely nothing but a burning desire to survive. I worked 3 jobs to put myself through college, eventually earning my degree in finance. I clawed my way up the corporate ladder to become a top-tier financial forensic investigator. My entire career was built on finding hidden money, exposing fraudsters, and destroying people who lie for profit. I built a life that was completely mine. I bought my own home, established a pristine reputation, and never looked back at the family that discarded me. I had heard through the grapevine that Marcus had married a white woman named Shelby, someone who shared his insatiable appetite for things they could not afford, but I kept my distance. I assumed they were living happily in their delusion. That illusion shattered at exactly 11:42 last night. I was sitting in my living room reviewing a case file when my phone vibrated across the glass coffee table. The caller identification showed a number I had not seen in a decade. It was Miss Loretta, our elderly neighbor, who used to sneak me homemade peach cobbler when my mother sent me to bed without dinner. I almost did not answer, but a strange instinct told me to pick up. The moment I heard her voice, my blood ran cold. "Chloe, baby, you need to come right now," she sobbed through the receiver. "The ambulance just took your mama away. She is not breathing right." I dropped my pen. My heart hammered violently against my ribs as Miss Loretta explained what she had heard through the thin walls connecting their townhouses. Marcus and his new wife Shelby had been at the house for hours. There was screaming, the sound of glass shattering, and Marcus demanding signatures for some kind of legal document. Then came a loud thud, followed by dead silence. By the time Miss Loretta peeked through her blinds, the paramedics were rushing my mother out on a stretcher, while Marcus and Shelby were busy gathering paperwork from the living room floor instead of following the ambulance. I did not even change out of my silk pajamas. I threw a heavy trench coat over my shoulders, grabbed my car keys, and sprinted out the door. The drive to Atlanta Medical Center was an absolute nightmare. A sudden Georgia thunderstorm had rolled in, unleashing a torrential downpour that made the slick roads incredibly dangerous. The windshield wipers violently slashed back and forth, struggling to clear the heavy sheets of rain, but my foot remained heavy on the gas pedal. The tires hydroplaned twice, yet I barely registered the danger. My mind was consumed by a toxic mixture of absolute terror and a deep, simmering rage. For 10 years I had convinced myself that I no longer cared about Beatrice. I told myself that the woman who could throw her own daughter away did not deserve my tears or my time. But as the glowing red hospital signs loomed closer in the rainy darkness, the harsh truth hit me. She was still my mother, and Marcus, the parasitic golden child, had finally pushed her over the edge. I gripped the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned stark white. I knew Marcus. I knew his greed knew no bounds. He had likely spent the last decade draining her dry, and now that the well was empty, he was trying to extract the very last drop of her livelihood while she took her dying breaths. I pulled into the emergency parking lot, slamming my luxury sedan into park. I ignored the freezing rain soaking my hair and my clothes as I ran toward the sliding automatic glass doors. I was preparing myself to face death. I was preparing myself to say a final goodbye to a mother who never truly protected me. I braced my heart for the worst possible outcome as I stepped into the sterile, bright lobby and demanded directions to the intensive care unit. But what I was not prepared for was the sickening scene waiting for me when I finally stepped off the elevator on the 5th floor. The intensive care unit waiting area was bathed in harsh fluorescent light that seemed to drain the color from everything it touched. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of industrial bleach, and the quiet, desperate prayers of families huddled in the corners. The only sounds were the rhythmic hissing of ventilators and the sharp, steady beeps of heart monitors echoing down the long, sterile hallway. I walked through the heavy double doors, my trench coat still dripping rainwater onto the linoleum floor. I braced myself for the sight of tears, for the frantic pacing of a worried son. What I found instead made my blood run entirely cold. Marcus and his wife Shelby were sitting in the uncomfortable plastic chairs near the nurses' station. They did not look like people whose mother was hovering between life and death. They looked like they were waiting for a flight at an airport lounge. Shelby had her legs crossed, one designer boot bouncing impatiently. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, not a single strand out of place from the storm outside. She was holding her phone up so Marcus could see the screen. I stood frozen a few yards away, close enough to hear them, but far enough to remain unnoticed. They were laughing. A soft, relaxed chuckle escaped my brother's lips as he tapped his wife's screen. I took a slow step closer and caught a glimpse of the glowing display. They were looking at a website for luxury Italian leather goods, debating the color of a $5,000 handbag. My mother was lying in a hospital bed less than 50 feet away, fighting for every single breath, and the golden child was online shopping with her money. I forced my eyes away from them and walked slowly toward my mother's room. Through the large observation window, I finally saw her. Beatrice, the woman who had ruled our household with an iron fist, the matriarch who had banished me with a single word 10 years ago, was completely unrecognizable. She looked so incredibly fragile, dwarfed by the massive medical equipment keeping her alive. A thick plastic tube was forced down her throat, connected to a machine that was breathing for her. Intravenous lines snaked into both of her arms. My chest tightened, a heavy knot of complicated grief settling in my throat. Despite everything she had done to me, despite the decade of silence and rejection, she was still my mother. No one deserved to be reduced to this. As my eyes moved over her frail form, the investigator in me took over. My brain was trained to look for anomalies, to spot the things that did not belong. That is when I saw it. Just above the medical tape, securing the needle on her left arm, the hospital gown had slipped down, revealing a dark, angry cluster of bruises. They were not the faint yellowish marks of an elderly person bumping into a table. These bruises were deep purple and shaped perfectly like the distinct impression of 4 fingers and a thumb. Someone had grabbed her violently. Someone had physically restrained her. Instantly, Miss Loretta's frantic words replayed in my mind. The screaming, the sound of shattered glass, Marcus demanding signatures, the loud thud, the puzzle pieces violently slammed into place. Marcus and Shelby had not just stressed her out. They had physically cornered her, intimidating her into signing away whatever assets they had not already managed to steal before the ambulance even arrived. A blinding, white-hot rage flared inside my chest. It took every ounce of self-control I possessed not to march over to the waiting area and wrap my hands around my brother's throat. I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the plastic table holding their terrible hospital coffee. I wanted to drag Shelby by her expensive highlighted hair and throw her out into the rain. But I took a deep breath, the cold hospital air filling my lungs, and forced the anger down into a tight, manageable box. Exploding would get me nowhere. If I caused a scene, Shelby would instantly weaponize her white tears. She would play the terrified victim, calling hospital security on the angry, aggressive black woman. Marcus would use it as proof that I was still the unstable, jealous sister he painted me to be 10 years ago. They would win. I do not play games I cannot win. I play to destroy. I turned my back on the glass window and walked silently over to the row of chairs directly across from them. I sat down, the wet fabric of my coat clinging to my skin. I reached into my bag and pulled out my tablet. The glow of the screen illuminated my face as I accessed my encrypted professional network. For the past 3 years, ever since I secured my position as a senior financial forensic investigator, I had been quietly keeping tabs on Marcus. I knew he was a financial parasite, and I knew it was only a matter of time before he drained my mother completely dry. What he did not know was that I had established a holding company that slowly bought up the debts he defaulted on. More importantly, because I understood the intricate loopholes of the banking system, better than anyone I knew exactly how to trigger federal fraud alerts on accounts suspected of elder financial abuse. I opened the secure dashboard. I could see the intricate web of my mother's finances displayed in stark numbers. There was her primary checking account heavily depleted. There was the home equity line of credit Marcus had coerced her into opening last year completely maxed out. And there was the joint account Marcus and Shelby used as their personal piggy bank, holding the very last chunk of her liquid retirement funds. I watched the screen update in real time. A pending transaction flashed across the ledger. They had just initiated a wire transfer for a luxury car down payment while the paramedics were actively loading my mother into the back of the ambulance. My jaw tightened, my teeth grinding together so hard my temples ached. I opened the back-end security portal linked to the Federal Financial Crimes Division I collaborated with. With surgical precision, I initiated a total asset freeze. I flagged the accounts under the highest severity code for suspected coercion, elder exploitation, and potential felony fraud. This was not a simple bank hold that could be undone with an angry phone call to customer service. This was a hard lock, a bureaucratic steel trap that would require a federal review, extensive legal documentation, and weeks of grueling investigation to even attempt to unlock. I selected the joint checking accounts. Confirmed. I selected the connected credit lines. Confirmed. I selected the emergency savings fund they were actively trying to siphon. Confirmed. My thumb hovered over the glowing red button on the screen that read Execute Security Protocol. I glanced up from the screen. Shelby was leaning her head on Marcus's shoulder, smiling brightly as she zoomed in on a picture of the designer bag. She looked so comfortable, so entirely secure in her stolen luxury. Marcus kissed the top of her head, completely unbothered by the absolute fact that the woman who gave him life was fighting for hers in the very next room. I looked back down at the screen. I pressed the button. The system processed the command for 3 agonizing seconds. Then a stark, bold notification popped up in the center of the display. Accounts frozen. A cold, incredibly satisfying calm washed over me. The violent storm inside my head settled into a quiet, deadly focus. I locked the tablet, slipped it back into my designer bag, and leaned back in the uncomfortable plastic chair. I crossed my legs and rested my hands gracefully in my lap. I did not need to scream. I did not need to cry. I just needed to wait. I watched them counting the seconds in my head, waiting for the exact moment the banking notification would hit their phones, waiting for the precise moment their entire comfortable world would violently collapse around them. The wait was shorter than I anticipated. Shelby shifted in her plastic seat, letting out a loud, exaggerated sigh that echoed down the quiet intensive care corridor. She complained that the fluorescent lights were giving her a migraine and that the smell of clinical antiseptic was ruining her expensive perfume. She stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from her designer skirt, and announced to Marcus that she needed an iced vanilla latte with oat milk. She said she could not possibly deal with this family drama without caffeine. Marcus nodded absently, his eyes still glued to his phone screen as he swiped through images of leather car interiors. He handed her his sleek metal credit card, the one I knew was directly linked to my mother's dwindling retirement savings. Shelby snatched it with a practiced motion, her diamond rings catching the harsh hospital light, and she strutted down the hallway toward the elevators. The sharp click of her stiletto heels faded as the metal doors slid shut behind her. I remained perfectly still in my chair watching Marcus. He was completely oblivious to the digital guillotine hovering over his neck. As a financial investigator, I have seen every type of fraudster. There are the sophisticated ones who hide millions in offshore shell companies, and then there are the parasites like my brother. Marcus was arrogant, sloppy, and dangerously entitled. He truly believed he had a divine right to every single dollar our mother had ever earned. He had spent the last decade convincing her that his constant business failures were just temporary setbacks draining her equity line by line. But the Porsche Macan was the final insult. A $75,000 luxury vehicle purchased just 24 hours ago, registered in his name, but funded entirely by a forced withdrawal from her pension account. The sheer audacity of it made my blood boil. He had likely bullied her into signing the transfer papers yesterday, screaming at her until her blood pressure spiked to a lethal level, triggering the stroke that put her in the room 50 feet away. 10 minutes passed. The elevator doors at the end of the hall dinged loudly, breaking the heavy silence. Shelby stepped out, and her demeanor had completely changed. There was no strut. There was no arrogant toss of her blonde hair. She was marching, her face flushed a furious, blotchy red. She did not have a coffee cup in her hand. She reached the waiting area and threw her expensive leather purse onto an empty chair with a loud smack. Marcus finally looked up from his phone, startled by the noise. Shelby stood over him, her voice trembling with a mixture of profound humiliation and absolute rage. She did not care that we were standing outside an intensive care unit. She did not care about the nurses peering out from the central station. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing that just was?" she hissed, her voice echoing off the linoleum walls. The barista at the lobby cafe swiped the card 3 times. 3 times, Marcus. And then she looked at me in front of a line of 10 doctors and told me the card was declined. She told me to step aside because I was holding up the line. "A $20 coffee order, and your black card was declined. Fix it right now." Marcus frowned, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. He stood up, lowering his voice in a desperate attempt to contain the scene she was causing. "Keep your voice down, Shelby," he whispered urgently. "That is impossible. The card is perfectly fine. We just moved $15,000 into that primary checking account yesterday afternoon to cover our spending for the week. Then explain to me why the machine said insufficient funds or account locked," she snapped back, crossing her arms tightly across her chest. "I am not going back down there until you call the bank and scream at whoever made this mistake. Do you know who was in that line? The chief of surgery. I looked like an absolute beggar." Marcus pulled his phone out, his fingers tapping the screen rapidly as he opened his mobile banking application. I watched him closely. I watched the confident, arrogant posture slowly drain out of his body. His eyes scanned the screen and his jaw went slack. He tapped the screen again, harder this time, refreshing the application. A small bead of sweat formed on his forehead. He swiped to a different banking app, checking the secondary accounts. Then he checked the joint credit cards. Every single screen displayed the exact same message. A solid red banner across the top of the interface that read, "Access denied. Account frozen pending federal security review." His breathing hitched. He stared at the glowing numbers, seeing nothing but zeros and restricted access codes. "What is happening?" he muttered to himself, his voice entirely devoid of its usual bravado. This does not make any sense. The bank cannot just freeze everything at once without calling me. There has to be a glitch in the system. He looked up, his eyes darting frantically around the hallway until they finally landed on me. I was sitting perfectly still, my hands resting gracefully in my lap, watching him with cold clinical detachment. His mind raced desperately trying to connect the dots. He knew what I did for a living. He knew the extent of my connections in the financial sector. He saw the complete lack of surprise on my face. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. You! He breathed out, his voice shaking. He took a step toward me, his hands balling into tight fists at his sides. You did this. You did something to the accounts. Shelby turned her head, looking back and forth between us, her anger temporarily replaced by sharp confusion. What is he talking about, Chloe? She demanded. Did you mess with our money? Marcus did not even let me answer. He stepped closer, his face twisting into an ugly mask of pure resentment. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, his voice rising in volume until it filled the entire corridor. You abandoned this family for 10 years, he yelled, completely ignoring the nurses who were now stepping out of their station to intervene. You turned your back on your own mother. You never visited. You never helped. And now you just waltz back in here while she is on a ventilator and you try to take control of her money. You think you can just come back and take control of my life. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting his frantic energy wash over me without affecting my calm. I stood up from the plastic chair, smoothing the invisible wrinkles from my tailored trousers. I stood at my full height, looking him dead in the eyes. I let a slow, chilling smirk touch the corner of my lips. Control? I asked softly, my voice steady and razor-sharp, cutting through the heavy hospital air. Or the right to drain Mom's retirement fund to put a down payment on a Porsche Macan yesterday. The silence that crashed down on the hallway was absolute. It was deafening. The nurses stopped moving. The distant hum of the medical machine seemed to fade away entirely. Marcus physically recoiled, as if I had just struck him across the face. The blood completely drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking pale and sickly under the fluorescent lights. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His mind was scrambling, desperately trying to figure out how I knew about the car. The transaction was completely hidden. He had used a secondary transfer sequence to mask the dealership wire, but he forgot that I am a professional at hunting down hidden assets. Shelby stood frozen beside him. The entitled fury vanished from her face, replaced instantly by raw, unfiltered panic. Her eyes went wide, staring at me as if she was seeing a ghost. She slowly turned her head to look at Marcus, waiting for him to deny it, waiting for him to scream at me for lying. She waited for the golden child to protect their stolen wealth. But Marcus said absolutely nothing. He just stared at me, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with the terrifying realization that he was completely outmatched. He had brought a temper tantrum to a corporate war. I owned the battlefield. I owned the weapons, and as of 10 minutes ago, I owned every single dollar he thought was his. They were completely and utterly speechless. I need to take a brief pause here. Just thinking about the sheer audacity of what happened next makes my muscles tense up. I stand up from my comfortable leather sofa and walk slowly over to the crystal decanter sitting on my mahogany side table. The heavy glass clinks softly as I pour myself a generous measure of Kentucky bourbon. I take a slow sip, letting the amber liquid burn a warm, grounding path down my throat. Some memories require a little fortification to revisit. Dealing with a thief is one thing, but dealing with a manipulative coward requires a completely different level of mental endurance. Let me take you back to that sterile, brightly lit hospital hallway. The suffocating silence that had fallen over Marcus and Shelby was finally broken by the heavy mechanical hiss of the intensive care unit doors swinging wide open. A tall doctor dressed in faded blue scrubs stepped out into the waiting area. He looked incredibly exhausted, the kind of deep fatigue that settles into the bones of people who fight death for a living. He held a silver clipboard in his hands and scanned the empty hallway until his eyes landed on the three of us. He asked for the family of Beatrice. The moment his voice echoed through the corridor, the tension shifted. We all snapped to attention. Marcus instinctively puffed out his chest and took a step forward, desperately trying to project the image of the responsible, grieving man of the house. But his hands were still visibly shaking from the financial execution I had just handed him moments prior. He swallowed hard and introduced himself as her son. I stepped up right beside him, completely ignoring his presence, and introduced myself as her daughter. The doctor did not waste any time with pleasantries. He looked at us with a grim, deeply serious expression and delivered the news. He explained that my mother had not simply forgotten to take her blood pressure medication as Shelby had so casually claimed earlier. She had suffered a massive acute stress-induced stroke. The doctor explained that her blood pressure had violently skyrocketed to a critical life-threatening level in a matter of minutes, causing a vital blood vessel in her brain to rupture under the immense pressure. He paused for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked directly at Marcus. The doctor asked a very specific question. He asked if my mother had experienced a severe emotional shock, an intense physical threat, or a violent confrontation immediately prior to her collapse. The guilt that washed over my brother's face was as clear and bright as a neon sign in the dark. All the blood drained from his cheeks. He could not even maintain eye contact with the medical professional standing in front of him. He stammered, looking down at his expensive shoes, offering a weak mumble about how they were just having a normal family discussion. I turned my head slowly, locking my eyes entirely onto Marcus. The puzzle pieces were fully assembled now. I closed the distance between us in two rapid, deliberate strides, backing him right up against the cold hospital wall. I did not yell. I did not raise my hands. I did not need to do any of those things to be terrifying. I leaned in close, ensuring my voice was a lethal, quiet whisper that only he and his wife could hear. "You did this to her," I said, making sure every single syllable landed like a physical blow to his chest. "You wanted that luxury car so badly that you cornered her. You screamed at her until her brain literally bled. You pushed your own mother into a stroke over a down payment." Marcus physically shrank against the wall. His eyes darted back and forth, looking for an escape route that did not exist. He tried to stutter out a pathetic defense, bringing his hands up in a weak attempt to shield his chest. He stammered that it was just an argument, that she was already sick, that I had no idea what I was talking about because I had not been around. He was crumbling under the weight of his own horrific actions. That is exactly when Shelby realized they were rapidly losing complete control of the narrative. Her stolen money was frozen. Her husband was backed into a corner and breaking down, and the doctor was looking at them with deep professional suspicion. She assessed the battlefield and decided to deploy the most dangerous, insidious weapon in her entire arsenal. She weaponized her white tears. Almost instantly, her entire demeanor shifted. It was a terrifying transformation to witness. The arrogant, demanding woman who had just loudly berated a hospital barista over a declined credit card completely vanished into thin air. Her face crumpled into a mask of pure devastation. She let out a loud, theatrical, heart-wrenching sob that echoed down the entire intensive care wing. She dramatically staggered backward, collapsing against the high counter of the nurse's station, as if her legs could no longer support her weight. She buried her face in her manicured hands, her shoulders shaking violently with manufactured grief. 3 nurses immediately rushed out from behind the desk, their faces filled with genuine concern for the sobbing blonde woman. Shelby looked up at them, her eyes wide and brimming with perfectly timed crystalline tears. She gasped for air, playing the role of the terrified damsel in distress with absolute perfection. "Please," she cried out, her voice trembling with fabricated terror, "you have to help us. Have to." She pointed a shaking diamond-clad finger directly at me. "She is threatening us. She is an aggressive woman and she has been verbally attacking my husband ever since she walked into this hospital. We are just trying to care for his sick mother, but she locked our bank accounts and now she is trying to physically intimidate us. Please, I am so incredibly scared of her. You have to keep her away from me." It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. It was the textbook definition of gaslighting. Within a matter of seconds, she had completely rewritten reality. She transformed herself and Marcus into the helpless, grieving victims, while expertly casting me as the angry, violent black woman who had stormed into a medical facility to cause chaos and harm. She knew exactly what stereotypes to tap into, and she knew exactly how the world would react to her tears. I watched the faces of the hospital staff shift in real time. The sympathetic professional looks they had given me just moments before completely vanished. They were replaced by guarded suspicion and immediate defensive posturing. The nurses moved closer to Shelby, forming a protective barrier between her and me. I saw one of the nurses reach under the desk, likely pressing the silent alarm. A heavy-set male security guard suddenly appeared at the end of the hallway, his hand resting cautiously on his radio, his eyes locked entirely on me. The trap was incredibly sophisticated. Shelby was actively trying to bait me into a reaction. If I raised my voice to defend myself, I would immediately validate her false claims. If I displayed even an ounce of the righteous anger burning inside me, I would be labeled a threat, escorted out of the building by security, and banned from seeing my own dying mother. I would be removed from the board entirely, leaving them free to continue their financial pillaging. I took a slow, deep breath, calculating my next move with absolute precision. I refused to let her tears dictate my reality. I stood perfectly still, keeping my hands visible and my expression completely neutral. I was not going to give them the satisfaction of an outburst. I was going to dismantle their entire charade piece by piece, and I was going to do it with the cold, calculated efficiency of a woman who knows exactly how much power she holds. Before the security guard could even unclip the radio from his belt to call for backup, the heavy glass door of my mother's room slid open with a sharp, mechanical thud. An intensive care nurse rushed out, her rubber clogs squeaking against the polished floor. She looked directly at the doctor and announced that the patient was regaining consciousness and fighting the ventilator tube. The entire dynamic in the hallway shifted in a fraction of a second. The security guard paused, his hand dropping from his radio. Shelby's theatrical sobbing instantly hitched, abruptly stopping as if someone had flipped a switch. The doctors and nurses immediately turned their attention away from the fabricated drama in the waiting area and rushed into the room to stabilize their patient. I did not wait for an invitation. I followed right behind the medical team, stepping into the dimly lit hospital room. The rhythmic, agonizing beep of the heart monitor was deafening in the confined space. The respiratory therapist worked quickly to extubate her, carefully sliding the heavy plastic tube from her throat. My mother coughed weakly, a harsh, rattling sound that tore at whatever lingering threads of childhood affection I still held for her. Her eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy, unfocused, and terrified. For a fleeting second, the tough, impenetrable armor I had built over the last 10 years completely melted away. I was not a senior financial investigator in that specific moment. I was just a daughter standing at the foot of her mother's hospital bed, terrified of losing her. I stepped forward, moving past the machines and the tangled wires. I reached out and gently placed my hand over hers. Her skin was incredibly cold, thin as parchment, and covered in those dark, violent bruises Marcus had left behind. I softly called her name, leaning down to reassure her that she was safe, that I was there, and that no one was going to hurt her ever again. Her cloudy eyes shifted, finally finding my face. I waited for a look of recognition, perhaps a glimmer of relief, or even a silent apology for the missing decade. Instead, her brow furrowed in deep distress. She looked at my hand resting on hers, and then with an agonizing amount of effort, she physically pulled her hand away from me. It was a weak, trembling movement, but it struck me harder than a physical blow. She turned her head away from me, her eyes frantically darting around the small room until they landed on the doorway. Marcus was standing there, hovering safely behind the nurses, looking like a cornered animal. My mother's face instantly softened. She reached her frail, bruised hand out into the empty air, stretching her trembling fingers entirely toward him. Her voice was nothing more than a dry, raspy whisper, damaged from the breathing tube, but the words echoed in that room with devastating clarity. "Do not yell at your brother," she wheezed, her chest heaving with the effort of speaking. "I willingly signed it for him. He needed it. Do not hurt him." The air was completely sucked out of the room. The nurses exchanged confused glances, but I stood frozen, my empty hand still suspended in the air where she had shoved it away. I stared down at the woman who had given me life, realizing with absolute terrifying clarity that there was no saving her. She did not want to be saved. She had just suffered a massive stroke because her golden child had violently intimidated her into signing away her last remaining dollars, and her very first conscious thought was to protect him from the consequences of his own abuse. It was a visceral, soul-crushing pain that only the family scapegoat could ever truly understand. No matter how successful I became, no matter how much money I made, no matter how fiercely I tried to protect her, I would always be the villain in her story. And Marcus the parasite, who was actively bleeding her dry and pushing her into an early grave, would always be her precious victim. The scene playing out before me was a perfectly twisted mirror image of the night she kicked me out 10 years ago. The physical memory of that night violently crashed over me. I was 24 years old, standing in our family living room holding the forged bank statements Marcus had used to steal my college fund. I had presented the absolute, undeniable proof of his theft. I had shown her his signature on the fraudulent transfers, but Marcus had simply fallen to his knees, burying his face in his hands, and unleashed a torrent of fake, pathetic tears. He claimed I had set him up because I was jealous of his new startup company. My mother had not even looked at the bank statements. She had immediately rushed to his side, wrapping her arms protectively around his shoulders, glaring up at me with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. She told me I was a bitter, hateful liar. She told me to pack my bags and leave the keys on the counter. She chose his comfortable lie over my devastating truth. A decade had passed, yet nothing had changed. The bank statements had simply been replaced by a hospital bed and a forged medical document. She was still wrapping her metaphorical arms around him, shielding him from the reality of his own monstrous behavior. I slowly pulled my hand back, letting it drop to my side. I straightened my posture, pulling my shoulders back. I could feel the profound disappointment settling deeply into my eyes, marking the exact moment the last remaining ember of my childhood hope permanently extinguished. The pain I felt was not just for the mother I never had, but for the pathetic reality of the woman lying in front of me. She was a willing participant in her own destruction. Marcus, sensing the absolute shift in the room, immediately capitalized on her blind devotion. His posture straightened. The trembling fear from the hallway vanished, replaced by that familiar, infuriating smirk. He stepped past the nurses and walked right up to the opposite side of the bed. He gently took the hand our mother was holding out to him, shooting me a look of pure, arrogant triumph across the white hospital sheets. "You heard her, Chloe," he said, his voice dripping with condescension and newly found confidence. "She gave it to me. She wanted me to have the money. You are in here causing a scene and stressing her out for absolutely nothing. You are the one putting her health at risk." Behind him, standing near the doorway, Shelby dabbed at her completely dry eyes with a tissue. She let out a soft, dramatic sigh of relief, leaning against the doorframe. The gaslighting was fully operational again. They had the matriarch's blessing spoken directly in front of the medical staff. To the doctors and nurses in that room, I was no longer the concerned daughter protecting a vulnerable patient. Thanks to my mother's blind loyalty, I was instantly recast as the aggressive, jealous sister trying to interfere with a consensual family financial arrangement. I looked at my mother one last time. Her eyes were closed again, her breathing labored but steady, her hand clutching my brother's fingers, as if he were her savior instead of her executioner. I realized then that fighting for her affection was a completely worthless endeavor. I did not need her love, and I certainly did not need her validation. I was not there to play the role of the dutiful daughter anymore. I was there as an apex predator in a financial jungle, and they had absolutely no idea how deep my trap had already been set. I stood perfectly still as Marcus puffed out his chest, completely emboldened by the blind validation our mother had just handed him. He looked down his nose at me, a smug, victorious sneer twisting his features. If there had been a camera in that hospital room, it would have been positioned low on the floor, looking up at me, capturing the exact moment my posture locked into an unbreakable stance of resilience. I did not shrink. I did not fold my arms defensively. I stood at my absolute full height, a towering presence of self-made authority in a room completely suffocated by delusion. You see that Chloe Marcus taunted, his voice dripping with venomous satisfaction as he gestured toward the bed where our mother lay with her eyes closed. She does not even want you in here. You have always been nothing but a bitter, selfish burden to this family. You come in here trying to throw your weight around with your little corporate job, but you have no power here. I let his words hit me, analyzing them with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a predictable experiment. 10 years ago, a statement like that would have shattered my heart into a million irreparable pieces. Today, it felt like a gentle breeze against a solid brick wall. He took a deliberate step closer, invading my personal space, lowering his voice into a malicious, calculated attack designed specifically to tear me down. You never cared about this family. He spat, his eyes narrowing with deep resentment. Not once. You never cared about us since the very day you refused to give me your first paycheck for my startup. You were always so obsessed with yourself. You missed every Thanksgiving. You missed every Christmas. You let Mom struggle while you were out there living the high life in your fancy apartment. You are a complete fraud. The sheer breathtaking delusion of his argument almost made me laugh out loud. My first paycheck. He actually had the absolute audacity to bring up my first paycheck. I kept my face perfectly neutral, but my mind instantly flashed back to the reality of that specific day. I was 22 years old. I had just landed an entry-level position at a grueling accounting firm in downtown Atlanta. I was living in a tiny, roach-infested studio apartment on the bad side of town because our mother had already kicked me out to make room for his massive home gym. I was surviving on instant ramen noodles and tap water, sleeping 4 hours a night, and studying until my eyes literally bled to pass my demanding financial certification exams. I was fighting tooth and nail just to keep a roof over my head. And Marcus, the brilliant visionary entrepreneur who had never worked a 40-hour week in his entire pampered life, had driven his brand new car paid for by our mother to my terrible apartment. He knocked on my door and demanded that I hand over my entire month of wages to fund his revolutionary app idea. It was an application designed to rate luxury dog clothing. It was a completely ridiculous, doomed venture with zero business plan and zero market research. When I looked him dead in the eye and told him no, he threw a violent temper tantrum in my living room, shattering my only coffee mug against the wall before storming out. That was the exact day I realized I had to build a fortress around myself. I told him no, and in his incredibly twisted mind, that made me the villain for the rest of my life. I looked at him now, standing in the intensive care unit, wearing a tailored Italian suit that he definitely did not pay for with his own hard-earned money. You actually think my success is a sign of selfishness? I asked, my voice deadly calm, but laced with absolute lethal precision. You think I built my life by abandoning this family? I stepped right into his space, forcing him to hold his ground or retreat. Let me remind you of exactly how I built my life, Marcus. While you were living rent-free in our mother's house, convincing her to take out second and third mortgages for your endless string of failed business ideas, I was working 3 jobs. I scrubbed floors at a diner on the weekends just to pay for my textbooks. I audited massive corporate spreadsheets until 2 in the morning. I clawed my way into the upper echelons of the financial sector without a single dollar of support from anyone in this room. I watched his jaw clench tightly. He absolutely hated hearing about my success. My wealth was a direct, glaring mirror reflecting his own profound incompetence. I earned every single promotion by being the smartest and hardest working person in the building. I continued refusing to raise my voice, letting the sheer crushing weight of the truth do the work for me. I bought my first investment property at 26. I started my own forensic investigation firm at 30. I built a multi-million-dollar net worth from absolutely nothing, and I tracked down men exactly like you for a living. Men who manipulate, who steal, who use their elderly family members as personal bank accounts because they are simply too weak and too incompetent to build anything of their own. I did not abandon this family, Marcus. I survived this family. Shelby shifted very uncomfortably by the door. The tension in the hospital room was becoming suffocating even for someone as emotionally detached as her. She opened her mouth to interject, desperately trying to defend her husband's fragile ego, but I shot her a look so incredibly cold and sharp that it froze the words right in her throat. She swallowed hard and looked down at the floor. Marcus tried to rally his failing courage. He desperately tried to maintain his illusion of absolute control. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed unnaturally against the sterile medical equipment surrounding us. "You think you are so superior with your fancy job and your money?" He sneered, his voice shaking just a fraction. "But look at you, Chloe. Look at where you are standing. You are standing here completely alone. Mom just proved it. All the money in the world cannot buy you a family who actually loves you. You are just a sad, lonely, miserable woman throwing a tantrum because nobody wants you around." It was his final desperate attempt at psychological warfare. He genuinely thought that attacking my isolation would break my spirit. He thought that reminding me I was unloved by our mother would send me running from the room in tears, exactly like it did when I was a vulnerable teenager. He wanted to strip away my professional armor and reduce me to the desperate girl who just wanted to belong to a family. But his entire calculation was completely and utterly wrong. Being alone was never my weakness. It was my greatest, most untouchable advantage. Because I had absolutely no emotional attachments holding me back, I had zero blind spots. I did not care about preserving the fake illusion of a happy, functional family. I did not care about keeping the peace. I only cared about absolute, undeniable justice. I let a slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. I looked at him, really looked at him, seeing nothing but a pathetic, terrified little boy hiding behind expensive stolen clothes and loud, empty insults. "You are exactly right, Marcus," I said softly, leaning in just slightly so he could feel the absolute certainty radiating from my words. "I am completely alone, and that is exactly why you should be terrified of me right now. I have absolutely nothing left to lose in this room. But you have an entire lavish lifestyle built on a fragile foundation of stolen money, and you just handed me the sledgehammer." Marcus stared at me for a split second, the reality of my threat hanging heavily in the sterile hospital air. Then an abrupt and erratic shift completely overtook his demeanor. He spun around on his expensive leather shoes, physically turning his back on me to face the doctor, who had just finished checking the monitors next to my mother's bed. The panic in his eyes was instantly replaced by a cold, calculating desperation. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a folded piece of thick, official-looking paper. His hands were still trembling slightly, but he thrust the document toward the doctor with an aggressive air of manufactured authority. "I am her eldest son, and her legally designated medical proxy," Marcus announced, his voice unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "I am taking over her care effectively, immediately. This hospital environment is clearly causing her far too much stress. You saw how her heart rate spiked just having an argument in the hallway. I want her completely disconnected from these machines, and I want her transferred back to her house for palliative hospice care tonight." The doctor froze his hand, hovering over the intravenous drip controls. He slowly turned around, taking the folded document from my brother's hand. He pushed his wire-rimmed glasses up the bridge of his nose and began to read the paperwork. I stood in the corner of the room watching the entire scene unfold with absolute clarity. I did not need to read the document to know exactly what it was. It was a medical power of attorney, and I knew exactly why he had suddenly decided to play this specific card right at this moment. It had absolutely nothing to do with my mother's comfort, and it certainly had nothing to do with reducing her stress. It was a simple, brutal financial calculation. Intensive care units are incredibly expensive. Every single day my mother spent hooked up to those advanced life-saving machines, receiving around-the-clock care from specialized medical professionals, was generating a massive hospital bill. Those bills would eventually become a heavy lien against her estate. They would eat directly into the equity of the Buckhead house. They would drain whatever liquid cash was left in the accounts I had not already frozen. Marcus knew that if she stayed in the hospital and fought for her life, his future inheritance would be completely decimated by medical debt. He was literally putting a price tag on his own mother's life. He had run the numbers in his head, and he had coldly decided that keeping her alive was simply too expensive for his lavish lifestyle. Shelby immediately stepped up to stand beside her husband, placing a supportive hand on his shoulder. She looked at the doctor with wide, innocent eyes, easily slipping back into her performance. "It is just so heartbreaking to see her like this," Shelby said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "She has always been such a strong, independent woman. She would absolutely hate being hooked up to all these terrible tubes and wires. We just want to bring her home to a familiar environment. We can hire a private nurse, light some soothing candles, and let her transition peacefully surrounded by the things she loves." It was sickening. They were openly advocating for a death sentence, dressing up their incredible greed in the language of compassion and dignity. The doctor finished reading the document and looked up at Marcus. His expression was a mixture of deep professional frustration and profound ethical horror. "Mr. Davis." The doctor began, keeping his voice carefully measured despite the obvious tension. "I must strongly advise against this course of action. Your mother just suffered a massive cardiovascular event. Her condition is incredibly unstable. She requires continuous hemodynamic monitoring and aggressive medical intervention to prevent secondary brain damage." The doctor stepped closer to Marcus, tapping the medical chart with his pen for emphasis. "If you remove her from this facility, if you disconnect her from this specialized respiratory support, she will not survive the ambulance ride home. Transitioning her to palliative care right now is not about keeping her comfortable. It is effectively terminating her life. I cannot ethically recommend discharging a patient in this critical state." Marcus did not even flinch. He did not look at his mother. He looked directly at the doctor, his jaw set in a stubborn, defiant line. "You heard her speak just a few minutes ago," Marcus countered, pointing a finger toward the bed. "She explicitly said she trusts me. She explicitly told everyone in this room not to hurt me, and that she signed the papers willingly. You are a doctor, but I am her son. I know what she wants better than anyone in this hospital. I have the notarized legal authority to make this decision, and my decision is to take her home. Now process the discharge paperwork." I watched the doctor's shoulders slump slightly. The heavy burden of the modern medical system was written all over his exhausted face. He was a man trained to save lives, but he was currently trapped inside a rigid legal framework that prioritized notarized signatures over common sense. He looked down at the medical power of attorney again, his eyes scanning the notary stamp and the witness signatures at the bottom of the page. The document appeared completely valid on its face. It had all the necessary legal jargon, the correct dates, and a signature that looked exactly like my mother's handwriting. "My hands are completely tied by the legal department," the doctor finally admitted, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "If you present a legally binding medical power of attorney and you refuse medical advice on behalf of the patient, the hospital cannot hold her here against her designated proxy's will. We will have to review this with the hospital administrator and the legal ethics board, but if the paperwork clears, you can force the discharge. However, I want it explicitly noted in her permanent medical record that this decision is being made entirely against the strongest medical advice of this attending staff. Marcus let out a short, arrogant breath of air. "Note whatever you want," he said dismissively. "Just get the paperwork started. We are leaving." The doctor shook his head in absolute disgust, turning on his heel and walking out of the room to consult with the hospital administration. The remaining nurses quietly backed away from the bed, shooting Marcus looks of pure contempt before following the doctor out into the hallway. The room fell silent again, save for the rhythmic pumping of the machines keeping my mother alive. Marcus slowly turned around to face me. The panic that had consumed him just moments ago was entirely gone. The color had returned to his face. He stood tall, holding that single piece of paper in his hand like an impenetrable shield. He looked at me with a smug, victorious smile that twisted his features into something truly ugly. He genuinely thought he had won. He thought he had found the perfect loophole to bypass my financial freeze. If he took her home and she passed away, the estate would immediately move into probate. As the primary beneficiary, he would eventually get the house and the assets, and I would be entirely removed from the equation. He thought he had outsmarted the system, outsmarted the doctors, and most importantly, outsmarted me. He held the document up slightly, making sure I could see the bold legal heading at the top of the page. "You can play your little games with the bank accounts all you want, Chloe," he sneered softly. "But I hold the cards that actually matter. She is coming home with me, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop it." I stood there looking at his arrogant, smiling face. I looked at Shelby, who was already pulling out her phone, likely searching for cheap hospice transport services to save a few extra dollars. They were so incredibly confident in their victory. They were so utterly convinced that their fraudulent piece of paper was the ultimate trump card. They had no idea that I was simply letting them dig their own graves a little deeper before I buried them completely. The heavy silence returned to the room the very moment the doctor's footsteps faded down the hallway to consult with the hospital administration. Marcus was still holding the medical proxy like a trophy, but it was Shelby who finally broke the quiet. The saccharine, tearful act she had put on for the nurses outside vanished entirely, replaced by a cold, hard impatience that distorted her pretty features. She aggressively crossed her arms, her expensive bracelets clinking loudly in the quiet space. She walked over to the side of the bed and looked down at my mother, not with the loving concern of a daughter-in-law, but with the calculated appraisal of a butcher looking at a piece of meat. "I am so incredibly tired of waiting around in this depressing place," Shelby snapped, her voice stripped of any warmth. She turned to Marcus, her tone demanding and sharp. "We need to expedite this. Every single hour she is plugged into these machines, the hospital is charging thousands of dollars. We cannot afford to let her drain the estate with medical debt just to delay the inevitable. She is old anyway, Marcus. We cannot afford this debt. Just tell them to pull the plug and be done with it." I watched her say those words right next to the woman who had welcomed her into this family with open arms. My mother had funded Shelby's lavish wedding, bought her expensive gifts, and defended her against every perceived slight. And yet here Shelby was casually advocating for her immediate death to save a few dollars on the inheritance. Marcus did not even flinch at his wife's callousness. He simply nodded in agreement, his eyes dark and completely devoid of any filial love. Shelby was not finished. She reached into her oversized designer tote bag and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. She marched over to the small rolling table positioned at the foot of the hospital bed and threw the envelope down with a sharp slap. She pulled out a stack of stapled papers and shoved them directly toward me. "You might as well stop hovering like a vulture, Chloe." Shelby sneered, her lips curling into a vicious smile. "You are wasting your time trying to play the concerned daughter. We already took care of everything. That is her updated last will and testament. She signed it yesterday afternoon right before her little medical episode." I looked down at the document resting on the gray plastic tray. The bold legal font across the top was unmistakable. I did not need to pick it up to know what it contained, But Shelby was more than happy to read the highlights out loud for my benefit. The Buckhead house, the property she has lived in for 30 years, goes entirely to Marcus. Shelby announced, her voice dripping with venomous triumph. Every single bank account, the cash, every remaining asset, and all the life insurance policies list him as the sole beneficiary. You get absolutely nothing, not a single cent. She explicitly wrote you out of the estate. So you can drop this ridiculous Savior Act right now. You have no legal standing, no inheritance, and no reason to be in this room. You might as well just pack up your fancy coat and leave. The Buckhead house was not just a piece of real estate. It was the physical manifestation of my father's incredibly hard work before he passed away. He had built that house from the ground up, paying for every brick with sweat and sacrifice, ensuring it would be a generational sanctuary for our family. My mother had sworn she would never sell it, that she would preserve it to keep his memory alive. Hearing Shelby so casually refer to it as an asset to be liquidated, hearing Marcus agree to sell the only piece of our father's legacy just to fund his lavish lifestyle, brought a sickening taste to my mouth. They were not just stealing money, they were erasing history. I kept my hands resting calmly at my sides. I let my eyes slowly travel from the fraudulent document on the table to Shelby's arrogant face, and finally to Marcus, who was standing tall, deeply satisfied with his wife's performance. They were practically vibrating with excitement. They genuinely believed they had executed the perfect crime. They had the medical proxy to control her life, and they had the will to control her money. In their narrow, greedy minds, they had completely boxed me out. You forced her to sign that yesterday, I stated flatly, my voice completely devoid of a question. It was a statement of absolute fact. You went to the house, you cornered her, and you screamed at her until she signed over her entire life to you. That is why she had the stroke. That is why she has bruises on her arms. You literally tortured an elderly woman for a house. Prove it! Marcus challenged instantly, his chin jutting out in defiance. He took a step forward, completely abandoning any pretense of innocence. Go ahead and try to prove it to a judge, Chloe. It is her signature. It is notarized by a legal professional. She just told the entire medical staff that she trusts me and wants me to handle her affairs. You think anyone is going to believe the estranged daughter, who has not been around for a decade, over the son who has been taking care of her every single day? You are nothing but an estranged, bitter outsider. He picked up the will from the table and waved it in my face. This piece of paper is ironclad. By this time tomorrow she will be back at the house on comfort care. When she passes, everything she owns belongs to me. I am going to sell that massive house, take the cash, and there is not a single thing you or your little corporate connections can do to stop me. I looked at the piece of paper fluttering inches from my face. I looked at the sloppy, trembling signature at the bottom of the page. It did not look like the steady, elegant handwriting my mother had possessed her entire life. It looked like the panicked, desperate scrawl of a terrified woman trying to appease her abuser. The sheer brutality of their plan was staggering, but their execution was incredibly flawed. They were playing checkers while I was managing a global chessboard. Their greed had made them completely blind to the reality of the situation. They were so focused on the immediate payout that they failed to consider the massive legal footprint they were leaving behind. Shelby was practically bouncing on her heels, eagerly anticipating my breakdown. She wanted me to scream. Me too. She wanted me to cry and beg for a piece of the pie, or at least beg for my mother's life. It gave her a twisted sense of power to lord this fraudulent victory over me. But I was entirely empty of tears. I looked from the fake will back to the rhythmic rise and fall of my mother's chest. Even now, heavily medicated and clinging to life by a thread, she was being used as nothing more than a pawn in their pathetic pursuit of unearned wealth. Marcus was already mentally spending the money from the sale of the house. He was probably planning to upgrade the Porsche he had just put a down payment on, completely ignoring the fact that the down payment was currently locked in a federal freeze that he still thought was a bank error. I let the silence stretch out intentionally, making the room uncomfortable. I watched as Marcus's hand slowly lowered the will, dropping back to his side, as my complete lack of reaction began to unnerve him. He expected a fight. He expected a dramatic confrontation full of empty threats. What he got instead was the absolute chilling stillness of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "If you are quite finished with your amateur theatrical performance," I finally said, keeping my voice incredibly level and polite, as if I were speaking to a particularly slow child, "I think it is time we discuss the actual reality of your situation. You see, Marcus, you have always been incredibly lazy. You cut corners, you forge signatures, you take the path of least resistance, and you assumed that because I was not sitting at the Sunday dinner table for the last 10 years, I was completely ignorant of your financial crimes." I reached into my designer tote bag, feeling the smooth leather against my fingertips as I bypassed my tablet and closed my hand around a thick sealed document folder. I had anticipated this exact maneuver. I knew that the moment her health failed, he would produce forged documents to seize control. "You brought a counterfeit piece of paper to a federal investigation," I continued, my voice dropping an octave as I prepared to absolutely demolish their entire world. I did not cry. I did not scream or beg or throw a tantrum the way they so desperately wanted me to. Instead, I let out a laugh. It started as a soft chuckle in the back of my throat and quickly blossomed into a loud, genuine laugh that echoed off the cold, tiled walls of the intensive care unit. The sound was so entirely out of place in that grim room that it caused Shelby to physically take a step backward. Her smug smile completely vanished, replaced by a look of profound unease. Marcus dropped his arm, the fraudulent will suddenly looking very small and insignificant in his trembling hand. I stood perfectly still in the center of the room, but the energy around me seemed to spin, pulling every ounce of power and authority directly into my orbit. I felt completely untouchable, as if the entire room was rotating around me, while I remained the absolute unmovable core of the conflict. I watched their arrogant confidence shatter into a million jagged pieces of confusion. They had built their entire criminal conspiracy on the assumption that I was weak, emotional, and uninformed. They were so spectacularly wrong. "You really think you are the first desperate relatives to forge a signature on a deathbed?" I asked, the laughter fading from my voice, leaving behind a cold, razor-sharp edge. "You think the hospital legal board, the probate judge, and the federal investigators are just going to look at that piece of paper and hand you the keys to $1 million estate without a single question?" Marcus swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. "It is her signature," he repeated, though his voice had lost all of its previous booming volume. "It is notarized." I slowly pulled the heavy sealed document folder the rest of the way out of my bag. It was thick bound in dark blue leather and secured with a heavy embossed seal. I did not rush. I let them stare at it. I let the sheer weight of the physical evidence sink into their minds before I even opened my mouth to explain what it was. "Let us talk about your timeline, Marcus," I said smoothly, stepping closer to the foot of the bed. "You claim she signed that will and that medical proxy yesterday afternoon. But according to the timestamp on the notary seal you so proudly shoved in the doctor's face, the paperwork was finalized at exactly 8 o'clock last night." I paused, letting my eyes dart toward the medical monitors blinking rhythmically beside my mother's bed, then back to my brother. "At 8 o'clock last night, the paramedics were actively loading our mother into the back of an ambulance. Her blood pressure was crashing. Her brain was actively bleeding. According to the official emergency medical technician report, which is a legally binding medical document, she was completely unresponsive and comatose by 7:45. The color instantly drained from Shelby's face. She looked at Marcus, her eyes wide with a sudden suffocating panic. She was realizing the fatal flaw in their brilliant plan. So unless our mother somehow woke up from a massive neurological hemorrhage, sat up on the stretcher, politely asked the paramedics for a pen, and signed a complex legal document while fighting for her life, your proxy is a blatant forgery. I continued, my voice echoing with absolute authority. And forgery of a legal document in an attempt to seize high-value real estate is not a misunderstanding. It is a Class C felony. You are not going to inherit a house. You are going to federal prison. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but his jaw just silently worked up and down. He looked down at the papers in his hand as if they had suddenly caught fire. The impenetrable shield he thought he held was actually a signed confession to a major financial crime. But I was not finished. I had promised to demolish their world, and I meant every single word. I unclasped the blue leather folder and pulled out a thick stack of genuine watermarked legal parchment. The top page bore the undeniable heavy red stamp of the Fulton County Superior Court. I held it up so the harsh fluorescent lights illuminated the official seal. Your proxy was signed at 8 o'clock last night while Mom was comatose, I said, delivering the final crushing blow. This is the comprehensive medical power of attorney Mom drafted with a senior estate lawyer exactly 3 years ago. Marcus stared at the document, his eyes darting frantically across the official letterhead. That is impossible, he stammered, shaking his head in frantic denial. She would never sign anything with you. She hated you. She has not spoken to you in a decade. She did not speak to me as a daughter, I corrected him, my tone dripping with icy precision. She spoke to me as a highly paid financial investigator who was the only person capable of saving her from you. I watched the realization slowly creep into his eyes as I laid out the brutal truth of his own incompetence. 3 years ago, Marcus had quietly defaulted on a massive commercial loan. He had secretly used the Buckhead house as collateral without telling our mother the full extent of his exposure. When the bank sent the final foreclosure notice, Beatrice panicked. Her absolute blind love for her golden child could not stop the bank from seizing her home. She was terrified, desperate, and entirely out of options. So she swallowed her immense pride and made a secret phone call to the corporate office of the daughter she had thrown away. She begged me to save the house. I explained, watching Marcus shrink smaller and smaller with every word. And I did. I untangled your massive financial mess. I negotiated with the lenders. I paid off the arrears using my own capital to keep a roof over her head. But I am not a charity, Marcus. I required collateral. I forced her to sign a completely irrevocable, comprehensive medical and financial power of attorney. I made her legally surrender her financial autonomy to me specifically in case you ever tried to bleed her dry again. Shelby let out a sharp gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. The entire foundation of her luxurious parasitic lifestyle was violently ripped out from beneath her designer boots. She signed it willingly in front of a judge, I stated, stepping right up to Marcus and looking down at the pathetic forgery still clutched in his hand. She gave me absolute, undeniable authority over every medical decision, every bank account, every property deed, and every single asset she possesses until the day she dies. This document supersedes anything you forge, anything you claim, and anything you try to execute. Marcus and Shelby were utterly stunned. They stood frozen in the middle of the intensive care unit, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of their defeat. They had spent 10 years thinking they had successfully banished me from the family, fully believing they had unfettered access to an endless supply of wealth. They had absolutely no idea that for the last 3 years, I had been the invisible landlord of their entire existence. I held the deed. I held the proxy. I held the keys to their survival. Now, I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying quiet calm as I slipped the heavy legal document back into the leather folder. You are going to take that fraudulent piece of trash you are holding and you are going to rip it into very small pieces. Then both of you are going to walk out of this hospital and you are never going to make another medical or financial decision for this woman again. Because if you say one more word, if you try to challenge my authority for even a single second, I will stop freezing your accounts and I will simply call the police. The choice is entirely yours. Marcus stood paralyzed for what felt like an eternity. His eyes darted frantically from my face to the heavy leather folder in my hands, searching for any sign of a bluff. He found absolutely nothing but cold, unyielding certainty. Slowly, agonizingly, his fingers tightened around the edges of his forged medical proxy. I watched with immense satisfaction as he pulled his hands apart, tearing the document straight down the middle. The sharp sound of ripping paper echoed in the quiet hospital room. He placed the torn pieces together and ripped them again, reducing his grand master plan to a handful of worthless confetti. He let the pieces fall from his trembling hands into the small plastic trash can beside the bed. Shelby looked like she was going to be physically sick. Her pristine posture had completely collapsed. She was staring at me with a mixture of profound terror and bitter envy. I had just dismantled their entire future in less than 5 minutes, and I had done it without ever raising my voice. Before Marcus could formulate a pathetic excuse or beg for mercy, the heavy glass doors slid open again. The attending doctor stepped back into the room, followed closely by a woman in a sharp gray suit who introduced herself as the chief hospital administrator. The doctor looked defensive, clearly prepared for a massive legal battle over the discharge paperwork Marcus had demanded. The administrator cleared her throat and looked directly at Marcus. "Mr. Davis," she began in a tight professional tone, "we have reviewed your request, but our legal department needs to verify the authenticity of this proxy, given the attending physician's strong objections to discharging the patient." "She will not be discharged," I interrupted smoothly, stepping forward and extending my hand to the administrator. "My name is Chloe. I am Beatrice's daughter, and I hold the sole irrevocable medical and financial power of attorney for her care. The document my brother presented to you earlier was a fraud, and he has formally withdrawn his request to move her." I handed the blue leather folder to the administrator. She opened it, her eyes quickly scanning the watermarked pages, the raised notary seal, and the official court stamp. The tension in her shoulders immediately dissolved. She looked up at me and offered a polite, respectful nod. "This is perfectly in order," she confirmed, closing the folder and handing it back to me. "You have full legal authority to direct her care. How would you like us to proceed?" I turned my head and looked directly at the attending doctor. The exhaustion on his face had been replaced by a profound sense of relief. "I want the absolute best care this facility can provide," I instructed him, my voice carrying the steady weight of absolute authority. "I want her moved to a private VIP recovery suite immediately. I want a dedicated team of your top neurological specialists consulting on her case around the clock. Spare absolutely no expense. If there is an experimental treatment, a specialized medication, or a top-tier surgeon who needs to be flown in from across the country, you authorize it and you bill it directly to me." The doctor blinked, clearly taken aback by the sudden and massive shift in resources. He looked down at his clipboard, doing a quick mental calculation of the astronomical costs associated with that level of elite medical care. "Ma'am," he started hesitantly, "I need to inform you that moving her to a specialized private suite and retaining an exclusive team of neurologists is not fully covered by standard Medicare. The out-of-pocket costs for this level of intensive customized care will be extraordinary. The hospital policy requires a substantial upfront retainer to initiate these specialized VIP protocols tonight." The administrator stepped forward, her expression apologetic but firm. "He is correct," she explained. "For a comprehensive care package of this magnitude, the billing department requires an immediate deposit of $50,000 before we can authorize the transfer to the private wing and page the off-duty specialists." Behind me, I heard Shelby let out a sharp, involuntary gasp. $50,000 was a life-altering amount of money to them. It was nearly the entire cost of the luxury car Marcus had just tried to buy. It was an amount they had spent the last 24 hours conspiring to steal, an amount they were literally willing to let our mother die to protect. I could feel their eyes burning into the back of my head, waiting for me to hesitate, waiting for me to balk at the massive price tag. I did not even blink. I reached into my bag and pulled out my wallet. I slid a solid, heavy metal platinum card from the leather slot and held it out toward the administrator. "Run it right now," I commanded softly. The administrator looked at the heavy card, then back up at my face. She quickly pulled a portable payment terminal from the pocket of her blazer, a device usually reserved for processing rapid high-tier payments in the executive suites. She inserted the metal card into the machine. The hospital room fell completely silent. The only sound was the rhythmic beeping of the life support monitors and the soft electronic hum of the payment terminal processing the transaction. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the screen. Approve the machine chimed loudly. The administrator smiled, tearing off the long receipt and handing my card back to me. "Thank you, Chloe," she said, her tone dripping with newfound reverence. "I will page the chief of neurology immediately and have the private suite prepared within the hour." I took my card and slipped it back into my wallet with slow, deliberate precision. Only then did I turn around to face Marcus and Shelby. The sight of them was incredibly pathetic. Marcus was staring at the payment terminal in the administrator's hand as if it were an alien artifact. His jaw was practically touching the floor. Shelby looked like she had just been slapped across the face. They had spent the entire evening screaming over a $20 coffee charge that their frozen accounts could not cover. They were entirely broke, their stolen funds locked behind a federal wall, their credit completely destroyed. And they had just watched me casually drop $50,000 on a Tuesday night to save the life of the woman they had tried to discard. It was the ultimate display of absolute crushing financial dominance. I did not just defeat them legally, I obliterated their entire perception of power. Marcus had spent his entire life measuring his worth by the money he could steal, the cars he could lease, and the false image of success he could project. I had just demonstrated what real, untouchable wealth looked like. "You can leave now," I told them, my voice cold and dismissive. "Get out of my sight." Marcus looked at me, his eyes wide and hollow. The arrogant golden child was completely gone, replaced by a terrified, broke man who finally realized he was outmatched. He did not say a single word. He reached out and grabbed Shelby by the arm, roughly pulling her toward the door. She stumbled slightly in her designer boots, her face pale and her eyes fixed firmly on the floor. I watched them walk out of the intensive care unit, their footsteps echoing down the long, sterile hallway. They looked small, defeated, and entirely powerless. I turned back to the bed, listening to the steady, strong rhythm of my mother's heartbeat on the monitor. I knew this was not the end of the war. Parasites do not just walk away when they are starving, and desperate people will always try one last foolish move to survive. But for tonight, I held the absolute upper hand, and they were finally learning exactly who they were dealing with. Marcus did not even make it entirely out of the intensive care unit before his fragile ego completely shattered. He stopped dead in his tracks, just shy of the heavy double doors. I watched his shoulders tense, the fabric of his expensive suit pulling tight across his back. He stood frozen for a few agonizing seconds, the realization of his absolute defeat finally piercing through his thick skull. He was not just broke. He had been thoroughly humiliated in front of the hospital administration, the medical staff, and the sister he had spent a decade convincing himself was inferior. The $50,000 transaction had broken something fundamental inside his brain. He slowly turned around to face me. The hollow, defeated look in his eyes was entirely gone, replaced by a wild, unhinged fury. His face contorted into an ugly, animalistic snarl, completely devoid of any rational thought. The golden child was dead, leaving only a cornered, desperate parasite who had just watched his host slip out of his grasp. "You think you are better than me," he screamed, his voice tearing violently through the quiet hum of the medical machines. The sheer volume of his outburst made the attending nurse flinch. "You think you can just come in here and buy her love? You think your money makes you invincible?" He did not give me a chance to respond. He lunged. He shoved Shelby out of the way so forcefully that she stumbled into the doorframe. He charged across the hospital room, his hands curled into tight fists, his eyes locked onto my throat. It was the desperate, pathetic charge of a man who had absolutely no strategic moves left. The sudden violence of his movement sent a shockwave of chaos through the room. Medical trays rattled as he bumped into the foot of the bed. I did not scream. I did not even take a step back. I simply braced my stance, ready to defend myself, but I did not have to lift a single finger. The hospital security guard, the exact same heavy-set man Shelby had tried to weaponize against me earlier, with her fake white tears, was still stationed just outside the room in the hallway. He had seen the entire exchange. He had watched me calmly provide the federal legal documents, and he had watched Marcus unravel. The moment Marcus broke into a sprint, the guard moved with incredible speed. He tackled my brother just inches before his outstretched hands could reach my collar. The impact was brutal and loud. The guard caught Marcus around the waist, driving him hard into the polished linoleum floor. The heavy thud of their bodies hitting the ground echoed down the corridor. Marcus thrashed wildly like a caught fish, screaming absolute nonsense, kicking his expensive shoes against the baseboards as he tried to throw the much larger guard off of his back. "Let go of me!" Marcus roared, his voice cracking with pure hysteria. "She stole my money. She stole my house. I am going to kill her." The guard swiftly pinned Marcus on his stomach, driving a heavy knee into the center of his back to completely immobilize him. "Sir, if you do not stop resisting immediately, I am putting you in handcuffs and calling the Atlanta Police Department." The guard ordered, his voice booming with absolute authority. "You are assaulting family members in an intensive care unit. Stay down." The chaos was suffocating, yet I remained perfectly still. I looked down at my older brother, the man who had tormented me for my entire childhood, the man who had effortlessly convinced our mother to throw me out on the streets. He was currently pinned to a hospital floor, his face pressed against the cold linoleum, whining and gasping for air, while his tailored suit jacket twisted awkwardly around his shoulders. He looked incredibly small. He looked exactly like the pathetic fraud I always knew he was. Shelby finally recovered from being shoved. She scrambled into the room, her high heels clicking frantically against the floor. Her face was pale with shock, but her instinct for self-preservation quickly overrode her embarrassment. She dropped to her knees beside the security guard, desperately tugging at her husband's arm. "Please let him go." Shelby begged the guard, her voice shaking but devoid of the theatrical tears from earlier. "This is real panic now. He is just stressed. His mother is sick. We are leaving right now. I promise we are leaving. Please do not call the police." The security guard looked up at me silently, asking for my direction. I held the absolute power to press charges. I could have him arrested for assault right then and there. I could have completely destroyed his pristine public record and sent him to a holding cell for the night. But an assault charge was far too simple. It would give him an immediate excuse to play the victim again. I wanted him to hang himself with a much thicker rope. "Let him up," I said calmly, my voice easily cutting through the sound of Marcus's heavy breathing. "But if he steps foot on this hospital floor ever again, I want him arrested for trespassing." The guard nodded grimly. He slowly shifted his weight off my brother's back, keeping a firm grip on his collar until Marcus was standing on his own 2 feet. Marcus brushed violently at his suit, his chest heaving, his face burning a bright, humiliating crimson. He could not even bring himself to look me in the eye. He stared at the floor, breathing heavily through his nose, completely broken. Shelby grabbed his arm, practically dragging him toward the door. She was terrified of the security guard, but as she reached the threshold of the room, her deeply ingrained entitlement flared up one final time. She stopped, turning her head to look at me over her shoulder. Her blonde hair was disheveled, her makeup slightly smeared, but her eyes were entirely filled with a toxic, venomous hatred. She did not yell. She leaned forward slightly, hissing her words through tightly clenched teeth, so only I could hear the absolute venom in her voice. "You think you have won because you threw some money around?" she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. "You just wait, Chloe. You think that piece of paper stops me. I still have the original deed. I have the contacts. Even if that miserable old woman lives through the night, I am selling that house tomorrow. You hear me? I am liquidating that property. And I am taking every single cent." It was a declaration of war built entirely on profound ignorance. She genuinely believed that physical possession of an old property deed somehow bypassed my federal proxy and the digital fortress I had built around the estate. She thought she could just march into a shady real estate broker's office and sell a multi-million-dollar property out from under me. I did not argue with her. I did not try to explain the intricacies of property law or the absolute foolishness of her threat. When an enemy is making a catastrophic mistake, you never interrupt them. "Good luck with that, Shelby," I replied softly, offering her a chilling, empty smile. She sneered, turning her back on me and dragging her disgraced husband out the door. The heavy glass slid shut behind them, finally sealing them out of my mother's room. The quiet hum of the medical equipment returned to the forefront of the room. The chaos had passed, leaving behind a cold, sharp clarity. They were going to try to sell the house. They were going to try to commit felony real estate fraud out of sheer desperation. I walked over to the uncomfortable plastic chair in the corner of the room, sat down and pulled my phone from my pocket. I had a few calls to make to my legal team. The trap was already set, but now it was time to open the door and invite them to step inside. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of real estate theft. I was more than happy to let them try, let them dig their own graves. I would provide the shovels. 3 days passed. The elite neurological team I hired worked absolute miracles. My mother was transferred out of the sterile intensive care unit and moved into a sprawling private VIP recovery suite on the top floor of the hospital. The room looked more like a luxury penthouse than a medical facility, complete with mahogany furniture, panoramic windows overlooking the Atlanta skyline, and a plush leather sofa where I had set up my remote workstation. My mother was stabilizing. She was awake, her speech was slowly returning, and she was entirely out of immediate physical danger. If this were a documentary film, the camera would slowly pull back right now, expanding into a wide shot that captured the entire room. It would show my mother resting quietly in the specialized medical bed, and it would show me sitting on the leather sofa, confidently crossing my legs as I reviewed a digital stack of case files on my tablet. I had spent the last 72 hours meticulously laying out the legal tripwires for my brother and his wife. I knew exactly what they were planning. Shelby had made her intentions perfectly clear back in the intensive care unit, and arrogant people rarely changed their minds. I had instructed the hospital security desk downstairs to allow them up to the VIP floor without any harassment. A trap is completely useless if you do not invite the mice inside. Right on cue, the heavy oak door of the recovery suite swung open. Marcus and Shelby marched into the room, exuding a desperate, frantic energy. But they had not come alone. Trailing closely behind them was a man who looked like he had stepped straight out of a late-night television commercial for questionable legal services. He was wearing a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit that desperately needed a good ironing. His briefcase was made of scuffed synthetic leather, and his eyes darted nervously around the luxurious suite, clearly unaccustomed to such high-end surroundings. This was Marcus's grand counterattack. A bargain bin attorney hired to intimidate a senior financial forensic investigator. Marcus completely ignored me. He walked straight past the leather sofa and approached my mother's bed. Beatrice looked up at him, a weak, hopeful smile attempting to form on her tired face. She still believed her golden child had come to check on her health. She still believed his presence was motivated by love. She reached her frail hand out toward him just like she had 3 days ago. But Marcus did not take her hand. He did not ask how she was feeling. He did not even offer a single word of comfort. Instead, he turned to the shady lawyer and snapped his fingers impatiently. The lawyer fumbled with the brass latch on his cheap briefcase, pulling out a single sheet of stark white paper. Marcus snatched the document from the man's hands and tossed it carelessly onto my mother's lap, right over her pristine hospital blankets. It was a formal, legally drafted notice of eviction. My mother stared down at the paper, her cloudy eyes slowly reading the bold black letters printed across the top. Her brow furrowed in deep confusion. She looked up at Marcus, her voice weak and trembling, as she asked him what this meant. Marcus stood tall, puffing his chest out in a pathetic display of dominance. "That is a 30-day notice to vacate the premises, Mom," he stated coldly, his voice entirely devoid of any human empathy. "You need to arrange for alternative living accommodations immediately upon your discharge. Shelby and I have officially listed the Buckhead estate on the market, and we have already secured a highly motivated cash buyer. They are willing to close the deal by the end of the week for $1.2 million. The monitor tracking my mother's heart rate spiked noticeably, the rhythmic beeps accelerating into a frantic, panicked tempo. She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "But that is my home," she whispered, her voice cracking with raw, emotional pain. "Your father built that house with his own two hands. You cannot sell my home, Marcus. Where am I supposed to go?" Shelby stepped forward, crossing her arms and looking down at the woman who had funded her extravagant lifestyle for years. "Oh, please, Beatrice, do not be so incredibly dramatic." Shelby scoffed dramatically, rolling her eyes. "You just had a massive stroke. You cannot possibly live in a huge multi-story house by yourself anyway. We found a very reasonably priced assisted living facility just outside the city limits. It is perfectly adequate for someone in your deteriorating condition. We are doing this for your own good. We need the liquid cash right now to fund our new investments, and sitting on $1 million property is simply bad business." The cheap lawyer cleared his throat, attempting to sound authoritative as he looked at my mother. "According to the updated last will and testament, as well as the preliminary transfer documents your son holds, he is acting well within his legal rights to liquidate the asset to preserve the value of the estate," the lawyer recited mechanically. "We expect the premises to be completely vacated by the end of the month, or we will be forced to involve the county sheriff for a formal physical removal." I sat on the sofa, remaining completely silent. I watched the absolute devastation wash over my mother's face. For her entire life, she had sacrificed everything for Marcus. She had alienated her own daughter, drained her life savings, and compromised her moral compass just to keep him happy. And this was her ultimate reward. Her golden child was serving her with an eviction notice in her hospital bed, threatening to have her physically dragged out of her own home by the police so he could steal her money to fund his fraudulent investments. It was a brutal, unforgiving awakening. I could have stopped it immediately. I could have stood up, flashed the real property deed, and sent the fake lawyer running for the hills in absolute terror. But I needed Marcus to fully commit. In the world of financial crime, intent is everything. By bringing a lawyer, serving a formal eviction notice, and officially accepting a cash offer on a property he did not legally own, Marcus was upgrading his crime from a simple family dispute into a highly documented, multi-layered federal conspiracy. He was handing me the nails for his own coffin, and I was more than happy to let him keep hammering them in. Marcus turned his attention away from his crying mother and finally looked directly at me. He expected me to be furious. He expected me to jump up and start screaming about the medical proxy I had weaponized against him earlier in the week. He pointed a finger at me, his face twisting into an arrogant sneer. "You see, Chloe," he boasted loudly, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls of the luxurious suite. "Your little stunt with the bank accounts the other night was nothing but a temporary inconvenience. You might control the cash in those specific checking accounts, but you cannot stop a private real estate transaction. The buyer is bringing $1.2 million in untraceable funds to a private escrow account. Once that money clears, Shelby and I are moving to the coast. You can stay here and play nurse with the old woman. We are completely done with both of you." I looked at the lawyer, taking in his sweaty brow and his nervous, shifty demeanor. "You are advising your client to sell a property based on a contested will while the legal owner is still very much alive?" I asked him calmly, my voice steady and perfectly modulated. "Are you acting as the closing agent for this $1.2 million cash transaction?" The lawyer puffed up his chest, clearly insulted by my calm questioning. "I am a licensed attorney representing the legal interests of Mr. Davis," he replied defensively, adjusting his cheap tie. "And yes, my firm is handling the escrow. We have already received the earnest money deposit from the buyer. The title search is being expedited as we speak. You have absolutely no legal standing to interfere with this closing. If you attempt to block the sale, we will sue you for tortious interference and demand damages." I could not help but smile. It was a small, chilling smile that made the cheap lawyer shift uncomfortably on his feet. He had just admitted on the record in front of multiple witnesses that he was actively facilitating a fraudulent escrow account across state lines. The wire fraud implications alone were staggering. Marcus mistook my silence for defeat. He laughed, a harsh, grating sound that filled the room. "Look at her, Shelby," Marcus mocked, wrapping his arms securely around his wife's waist. "She finally realizes she is completely powerless. You thought your little corporate job made you untouchable, Chloe. You thought your money made you better than us. But in the real world, cash is king. We are selling the house, we are taking the money, and you are going to lose everything you tried to protect. Have fun packing up her hospital bags. We have a closing to attend." My fingers rhythmically tapped against the smooth leather armrest of the sofa. Tap, tap, tap. It was the only sound in the room for a long, heavy moment after Marcus delivered his arrogant declaration. He stood there practically vibrating with triumphant energy, thoroughly convinced he had just delivered the final checkmate in a game I had been playing for years. My mother shattered the silence. A low, agonizing sob tore from her throat, a sound so entirely broken, it would have moved any normal human being to immediate compassion. She pushed herself up slightly against the hospital pillows, the monitoring wires tangling around her frail arms as she reached out to her son one last time. "Marcus, please," she begged, her voice trembling violently. "You cannot do this to me. Not now, not after everything I have done for you. I gave you every single thing you ever asked for. I took out those loans for your businesses. I paid for Shelby's wedding. I gave you my savings. That house is the very last thing I have in this world. It is the only piece of your father I have left. Please do not take my home." It was a plea born of absolute desperation. She was finally laying out the staggering truth of her lifelong sacrifice, hoping that the sheer weight of her generosity would somehow spark a shred of guilt in his cold heart. She was looking at him not as a financial obstacle, but as her son. The boy she had coddled, protected, and favored over me her entire life. Marcus looked down at her, his face an impenetrable mask of pure apathy. He did not see a grieving widow. He did not see a mother recovering from a massive stroke. He saw a depreciating asset standing between him and a multi-million-dollar payout. "You should have thought about the future before you had a stroke and became a massive financial liability." Marcus replied, his words dropping into the room like heavy blocks of ice. "I am not going to pause my entire life just to maintain a museum for Dad's memory. The house is way too big for you now anyway. It requires constant maintenance, the property taxes are ridiculous, and frankly, I need the capital to secure my own future. You had your time in that house. Now it is my turn to cash out." Shelby nodded vigorously in agreement, adjusting the strap of her designer handbag. "Exactly." Beatrice Shelby chimed in, her voice dripping with that toxic fake sympathy she always weaponized. "We have to be practical here. Marcus has been under so much stress trying to manage your chaotic affairs. It is actually incredibly selfish of you to expect him to carry the burden of that massive estate when we have a willing cash buyer ready to wire the funds today. We are doing you a favor. You will be much happier in a managed care facility where people can watch you properly." My mother let out another devastating sob, her hands dropping uselessly to her lap. The absolute cruelty of their words finally broke through her decades of willful blindness. She was realizing far too late that the golden child she had worshipped was nothing more than a parasite who would gladly step over her dying body to pick up a dollar bill. She slowly turned her head toward me. Her tear-filled eyes met mine, silently pleading for the very first time in her life. She was looking at the daughter she had banished, the scapegoat she had thrown away, begging me to use that untouchable corporate power Marcus had just mocked to save her from the monster she had created. I stopped tapping my fingers against the armrest. I stood up from the leather sofa, my movements slow and deliberate. I walked across the plush carpet, stepping right past the sweating cheap lawyer, and stopped beside my mother's bed. I reached down and gently took her frail, trembling hand in mine. Her fingers felt like ice. She squeezed my hand, tightly clinging to me as her last remaining lifeline. I looked down at her tear-stained face, analyzing the profound terror in her eyes. I could have ended her suffering right then and there. I could have pulled the authentic federally stamped property deed from my briefcase and completely obliterated Marcus's entire fraudulent sale. I could have saved her the agonizing pain of believing she was going to be thrown out onto the street. But I did not. "Let them sell it, Mom," I said quietly. My mother gasped, her eyes widening in absolute shock. Her grip on my hand loosened instantly, a fresh wave of betrayal washing over her face. She thought I was abandoning her again. She thought I was conceding defeat and leaving her to the wolves. "Chloe." "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You cannot let them do this." I tightened my grip on her hand, refusing to let her pull away, but I did not break my stoic expression. I did not offer her a warm smile or a reassuring whisper. It was a moment of calculated cruelty, a necessary surgical strike to her psyche. For 10 years she had lived in a comfortable delusion, completely shielding Marcus from the consequences of his own actions. If I swooped in and saved the day right now, she would eventually find a way to forgive him. She would rationalize his behavior. She would convince herself that he was just stressed or that Shelby had manipulated him. I needed her to feel the absolute searing pain of his betrayal so deeply that she would never ever let him back into her life. I needed her to watch him swing the axe. I turned my head and looked directly at Marcus. He was smirking, thoroughly enjoying what he perceived as my complete surrender. "If you have a cash buyer waiting, you should not keep them waiting," I told Marcus, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "Real estate markets are volatile. You need to take those documents, go directly to the notary, and get the signatures finalized. Tell your escrow agent to prepare the wire transfer instructions for the buyer immediately. Do not waste another second standing in this hospital room arguing with us." The cheap lawyer looked at me, thoroughly bewildered by my sudden compliance. He had expected a massive legal battle, a screaming match, or at least a threat of litigation. Instead, I was giving them the green light to proceed with a $1.2 million transaction. "Are you formally waiving your right to contest the sale?" the lawyer asked, his eyes narrowing with suspicion as he clutched his synthetic leather briefcase. "I am formally advising you to do exactly what your client is paying you to do," I replied smoothly, staring the lawyer down until he nervously looked away. "Process the paperwork, go to the bank, execute the closing." Marcus laughed out loud, a booming sound of pure, unadulterated arrogance. He clapped the lawyer hard on the shoulder, practically pushing the man toward the door. "You hear that?" Marcus crowed, pointing a triumphant finger at me. "She knows she is completely beaten. She knows she does not have a single piece of leverage left." He walked right up to the hospital bed, leaning over my mother without a single ounce of compassion. "Start packing your things, Mom," he ordered coldly. "The new owners want to do a final walkthrough of the property by Friday. I am not going to let you ruin this deal for me." Shelby practically skipped toward the door, her face glowing with the anticipation of unearned wealth. "Come on, Marcus," she urged, pulling on his arm. "We need to get to the title office before they close for lunch. I want to start looking at coastal properties tonight." Marcus turned his back on his weeping mother one last time. "See you around, Chloe." He threw over his shoulder, his voice dripping with condescending victory. "Try not to be too bitter when you realize you lost everything." They walked out of the VIP suite, the heavy oak door clicking firmly shut behind them. The room fell silent again, save for the sound of my mother's quiet, broken sobbing. She turned her face away from me, burying her head into the pristine white hospital pillows, completely crushed by the weight of my perceived betrayal and my brother's unfathomable cruelty. I stood beside her bed, my hand still resting on the mattress where she had pulled away from me. I did not apologize. I did not try to explain myself. I simply walked back over to the leather sofa, picked up my tablet, and opened the encrypted communication portal to my legal team and my contacts at the Federal Financial Crimes Division. They had just taken the bait completely. They were walking out of this hospital with a forged will, a fake eviction notice, and a fraudulent contract to sell a multi-million-dollar property they did not legally own. They were about to sit down in a notary's office and officially sign their names to federal wire fraud documents. They were about to instruct a bank to transfer over $1 million across state lines based on entirely fabricated legal authority. Marcus thought he was rushing toward the greatest financial victory of his life. He had absolutely no idea he was sprinting headfirst into an ironclad federal trap that I had meticulously designed specifically for him. He wanted to play the role of the ruthless businessman. I was going to let him play it all the way to a maximum security prison. I tapped the screen of my tablet, sending a single encoded message to the lead investigator on my team. The targets are moving to close the escrow. Let them finalize the signatures. We strike at the property. I locked the screen and placed the tablet face down on the coffee table. I looked over at my mother, who was still weeping silently into her pillows. The pain she was feeling right now was necessary. It was the harsh, burning medicine she needed to finally cure her of her lifelong addiction to my brother. She was mourning the loss of a son who never truly existed, and she was mourning the loss of a house that was never actually in danger. I leaned back against the leather sofa, crossing my legs elegantly, and let a slow, genuinely satisfied smile spread across my face. The absolute hardest part of the investigation was over. Now all I had to do was wait for moving day. If you were watching this story unfold on a cinema screen, this is the exact moment the camera would tilt sharply off its axis. A severe Dutch angle. The horizon line would violently skew, making the entire world look fundamentally unstable, dangerous, and deeply unsettling. That tilted perspective perfectly represented the reality Marcus and Shelby were currently living in. They thought they were standing on perfectly solid ground, walking a straight and victorious path toward a massive payday. In reality, the floor beneath them was angled directly into a dark abyss, and they were already sliding down at breakneck speed without even realizing it. It was Friday afternoon, exactly 48 hours after they stormed out of my mother's hospital suite. I was sitting at the polished mahogany dining table in my own home, miles away from the Buckhead estate. The hospital had formally discharged my mother the previous evening, completely bypassing Marcus's fraudulent demands, and she was now resting safely in my guest wing under the vigilant care of a private nurse. The quiet peace of my home was suddenly broken by the sharp, persistent vibration of my phone resting against the hard wood of the table, the screen illuminated with a new text message notification. I picked up the device and opened the text. It was from Shelby. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance radiating from the glowing words was almost tangible. It was not a request. It was a hostile command. Get your stuff and your old mother out of the house by 5 p.m. The message read, "We just signed the papers and took the deposit. The locks are being changed tonight, so do not try anything stupid. We are officially the owners now." I read the message twice. I did not feel a single ounce of anger. I did not feel threatened or intimidated. Instead, I felt an overwhelming wave of cold, professional satisfaction. Shelby was incredibly foolish. She was not just sending a cruel taunt to the sister-in-law she hated. She was sending a written, time-stamped confession to a major federal crime. By explicitly stating in writing that they had signed the papers and taken the deposit, she had just provided the final undeniable piece of documentary evidence required to execute the arrest warrants. She had voluntarily documented her own guilt and delivered it directly into the hands of a senior financial forensic investigator. I immediately took a high-resolution screenshot of the message and uploaded the image to the secure encrypted server shared with my corporate legal team and the Federal Financial Crimes Task Force. I opened my laptop and initiated a secure video conference. The screen quickly divided into 3 distinct grids. On one side was David, the senior litigation partner at my firm, who specialized in prosecuting high-level asset theft. On the other side was Special Agent Reynolds, the federal investigator I had been coordinating with relentlessly for the past week. "Did you both see the upload I just sent?" I asked, leaning forward and resting my elbows on the table. Agent Reynolds nodded, his face deadly serious under the harsh fluorescent lighting of his field office. "We saw it, Chloe. It matches the alerts we just received from the banking surveillance network. We also just secured the subpoenaed banking records from the title escrow company your brother utilized. The wire transfer was officially initiated 30 minutes ago. A non-refundable earnest money deposit of $120,000 cleared the escrow account and was moved directly into a newly opened routing number registered under Marcus and Shelby's joint names. They actually went through with it. They initiated a massive interstate wire transfer using a completely forged title deed." David adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, a predatory smile appearing on his face. The moment that money crossed state lines and landed in their personal bank account, this stopped being a simple civil dispute over a family inheritance. David explained, his voice ringing with legal certainty. "This is now felony wire fraud. It is grand theft real estate. It is conspiracy to commit financial exploitation, and it is blatant forgery of federal documents. The mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for these combined offenses are incredibly severe. They are looking at a decade behind bars in a federal penitentiary before parole is even a conversation." The trap had officially snapped shut. For 10 years, Marcus had operated entirely in the murky gray areas of family guilt and emotional manipulation. He had stolen money in ways that were practically impossible to prosecute because my mother always refused to press formal charges. She had always provided him with an alibi, or she would retroactively claim the stolen money was a generous gift to protect him from the law. But this time, my mother was not the legal owner of the asset he stole. My corporate holding company legally owned the Buckhead estate. Marcus had forged the signature of a corporate entity. He had bypassed federal banking regulations, and he had stolen funds from a third-party cash buyer who genuinely believed they were purchasing a legitimate piece of real estate. He had finally committed a massive, undeniable crime that our mother could not protect him from, even if she desperately wanted to. He had stepped out of the family living room and walked straight into a federal jurisdiction. Agent Reynolds held up a thick stack of papers on his end of the camera. "The federal magistrate signed the arrest warrants 10 minutes ago based on the wire transfer confirmation," he stated firmly. "We have tactical units standing by right now. We were initially planning to pick them up outside the shady title office, but since they are heading directly to the Buckhead property at 5 p.m. to change the locks and gloat, we can execute the arrest there. It keeps the public spectacle to a minimum and allows us to secure the physical premises immediately." "That works perfectly," I replied, closing the file folder resting on my desk. "I want to be there when it happens. I want to look them dead in the eye when they realize the stolen money is gone and their freedom is over. I will meet your units at the property at exactly 4:45. We ended the video call. The silence in my dining room was profound and heavy. I stood up and walked over to the large bay windows looking out over my meticulously landscaped backyard. The afternoon sun was bright, casting long shadows across the green lawn. Everything had led to this exact moment. Every insult I had swallowed, every holiday I had spent completely alone. Every night, I had laid awake wondering why I was never good enough to earn my own family's love. It was all culminating in a meticulously planned sequence of absolute legal and financial destruction. I felt a brief, fleeting pang of sorrow for the little girl I used to be. The vulnerable girl who just wanted her older brother to protect her and her mother to embrace her. But that girl was long gone. She had been completely burned away, replaced by a woman forged in the fire of their rejection. I was a woman who understood that true justice rarely comes from offering unconditional forgiveness. True justice comes from forcing absolute accountability. I walked down the quiet hallway to the guest wing. My mother was sitting in a comfortable plush armchair by the window, staring blankly out at the garden. The private nurse was quietly organizing her evening medication on a small silver tray. I did not tell my mother what was about to happen. She was still incredibly fragile, both physically and emotionally. She was still grieving the horrific, callous betrayal she had witnessed in the hospital. I simply told her I had some urgent business to attend to at the old house, and that I would return before dinner time. She nodded weakly, not asking any questions, completely resigned to the reality that I was now the one managing her life. I walked back to my master bedroom and changed my clothes. I put on a sharp-tailored black suit. It was the exact same armor I wore when I dismantled fraudulent corporate empires in high-stakes boardrooms, and it was the armor I would wear to completely dismantle my own brother. I slid my feet into a pair of black designer heels, the sharp click of the stilettos echoing against the hardwood floor like the relentless ticking of a countdown clock. I picked up my car keys and walked out the front door into the warm afternoon air. The drive to the Buckhead estate would take exactly 40 minutes in the heavy Atlanta traffic. Marcus and Shelby had demanded that I be completely gone by 5 p.m. They were expecting to walk into an empty, surrendered house. They were expecting to pop an expensive bottle of champagne, change the brass locks on the front door, and celebrate their brilliant, multi-million-dollar heist. They were expecting absolute, unhindered victory. They had absolutely no idea that the house they thought they just sold was currently being surrounded by federal agents. The countdown had officially begun, and they were completely out of time. The camera would start low on the ground right at this moment. It would capture the sharp, decisive crunch of gravel under the pointed toe of my black designer stilettos as I stepped out of my luxury sedan. Then the lens would slowly tilt upward, tracing the sharp lines of my tailored suit all the way up to my face. I was not smiling, but my expression radiated an absolute triumphant calm. I had finally arrived at the end of the war. The Buckhead estate was a sprawling, magnificent colonial brick mansion surrounded by centuries-old oak trees. It was the physical embodiment of my father's hard work. And right now, it was being treated like a yard sale. A massive white moving truck was parked illegally across the manicured front lawn, crushing the azalea bushes my mother had lovingly tended for decades. Marcus was standing on the grand front porch. He had taken off his suit jacket and rolled up the sleeves of his expensive dress shirt, looking like a lord surveying his newly conquered kingdom. He was shouting arrogant orders at a crew of exhausted movers who were actively carrying my mother's priceless antique dining chairs out the front door. Shelby was sitting in one of the wicker patio chairs near the massive white columns. She was holding a crystal champagne flute, laughing loudly at something Marcus said, completely oblivious to the massive storm gathering right at the end of the driveway. They did not notice my arrival at first, but they certainly noticed the convoy that pulled in directly behind me. Two black Federal Sport utility vehicles with deeply tinted windows rolled through the open wrought iron gates, their tires crunching loudly against the gravel. They were immediately followed by two marked Atlanta Police Department cruisers, their red and blue lights flashing in a silent, ominous warning. The vehicles formed a tactical blockade across the driveway, completely sealing off any possible exit. The sheer suddenness of the arrival caused the entire property to fall dead silent. The movers froze exactly where they stood, slowly lowering a heavy mahogany dresser to the porch floor, their eyes wide with alarm. Marcus stopped shouting mid-sentence. His arm dropped to his side. Shelby lowered her champagne flute, her laughter dying instantly in her throat. I closed the door of my sedan. The sound echoed across the massive lawn like a gunshot. I did not walk up the driveway alone. I was flanked by Special Agent Reynolds and another senior FBI investigator, both wearing their dark tactical vests emblazoned with bold yellow letters. 4 uniformed local police officers stepped out of their cruisers, immediately taking up strategic positions around the perimeter of the front yard, their hands resting cautiously near their heavy utility belts. We moved as a single coordinated unit toward the front steps. The power dynamic of the entire world had shifted in the blink of an eye, but Shelby was far too arrogant and far too ignorant to comprehend the reality of the situation. Her deeply ingrained entitlement flared up, completely blinding her to the federal agent standing right in front of her. She genuinely thought this was just another one of my attempts to negotiate or plead for my mother's belongings. Shelby slammed her champagne flute down onto a glass patio table so hard the crystal nearly shattered. She stood up, her face flushing with furious, indignant anger. She stomped her designer boots down the brick stairs, completely ignoring the armed federal agents, and pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "Did you seriously call the cops to throw a tantrum?" Shelby screamed, her voice shrill and echoing across the quiet, upscale neighborhood. "Are you actually this pathetic, Chloe? You think you can just bring the local police here to scare us out of a legal real estate sale? We have the signed paperwork. We have the deposit. The escrow already cleared into our bank account an hour ago. You are trespassing on private property right now. This is my house." I stopped walking. I stood perfectly still at the bottom of the brick staircase, looking up at her with a completely unreadable expression. I let her words hang in the warm afternoon air. I let her loudly and proudly claim ownership of a property she was about to go to federal prison for trying to steal. Marcus finally found his legs. He hurried down the stairs to stand beside his wife, trying desperately to project an air of confident authority, but his eyes were darting nervously toward the tactical vests the agents were wearing. He knew the difference between local city cops and federal investigators. The color was rapidly draining from his face, leaving his skin looking sickly and pale under the Georgia sun. "Officers, you need to escort this woman off the premises immediately," Marcus commanded, his voice cracking slightly as he addressed the uniformed police. "She is a disgruntled family member who is extremely upset about a legal transaction. She has absolutely no right to be here. We are the legal owners of this estate, and we demand that you remove her before we press charges for harassment." Agent Reynolds stepped forward, closing the distance between us and my brother. He did not look angry. He looked entirely professional and completely bored, which made him infinitely more terrifying. He reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a thick stack of folded legal documents. He did not hand them to Marcus. He simply held them up so the bold federal seals were clearly visible in the sunlight. Marcus Davis, Agent Reynolds, announced, his voice a deep, booming baritone that commanded absolute compliance. "You are not the owner of this property. You are currently standing on a frozen asset directly linked to an active federal investigation regarding interstate wire fraud conspiracy to commit real estate theft and the forgery of corporate documents." Shelby let out a loud, mocking scoff, completely oblivious to the devastating gravity of the words. "Wire fraud," she repeated, rolling her eyes dramatically and crossing her arms. "You people are absolutely ridiculous. Chloe is making all of this up because she is incredibly jealous of our success. We sold a house that belonged to my husband through his mother's will. It is a private family matter. You need to leave our property before I call our attorney and have all of your badges taken away for harassment." I finally spoke. My voice was quiet, but it carried the lethal precision of a sniper's bullet. I looked past Shelby and locked eyes directly with my brother. "You should have listened to me in the hospital, Marcus," I said softly. "I told you that you were completely outmatched. But you just could not resist the cash. You had to have the $1 million. You had to sign the papers." I took a slow step up the first brick stair, physically invading their elevated space. The absolute panic was finally setting into Shelby's eyes as she looked at her husband and saw that he was not arguing. He was not screaming back at the officers. He was just staring at me, his chest heaving, his entire body trembling violently as the monumental weight of his actions crashed down upon him. He had taken the bait. He had signed the fraudulent documents. He had accepted the stolen wire transfer. And now the bill was finally due. The world behind me seemed to blur entirely. The federal agents, the police cruisers, even Shelby pacing nervously on the porch, all faded into a soft, insignificant background. My focus was razor-sharp, locked entirely onto the terrified eyes of the brother who had tormented me for my entire life. "You really thought you could just walk into a notary office and sell a multi-million-dollar estate out from under me?" I asked, my voice carrying the steady, cold weight of an executioner swinging the axe. "You thought the fake will gave you the keys to the kingdom. But a will can only distribute assets that the deceased actually owns, Marcus. And this house has not belonged to our mother for 5 entire years." Marcus physically recoiled as if he had been struck. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, feeling the ground actively crumbling beneath his expensive leather shoes. I am sure you remember your little trip to Atlantic City 5 years ago. I continued taking another slow step up the brick stairs. You racked up a massive gambling debt with some incredibly dangerous people. You panicked, and you did what you always do. You ran crying to Mom. You manipulated her into taking out an illegal second mortgage on this exact property to cover your tracks and save your kneecaps. Shelby whipped her head around to look at her husband. You told me that loan was for a startup business. She hissed, her voice trembling with sudden realization. He completely ignored her, his eyes perfectly locked on me in absolute unadulterated horror. But you defaulted on that mortgage within 6 months, I stated, raising my voice just enough so the federal agents behind me could hear every single word clearly. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings. Mom was going to lose her home and end up on the street because of your reckless greed. So she swallowed her pride, and she called the only person she knew who could actually navigate the complex financial system. She called me. I stopped on the top stair, standing on equal footing with him now. I did not just pay off your debt, Marcus. I am a financial investigator. I used my corporate shell company to completely purchase the debt portfolio directly from the lending institution. I bought the paper, and when you continued to miss the payments, my company legally foreclosed on the property. We executed a private transfer of the deed. I let Mom continue living here as a tenant on my charity because she is my mother. But I control the foundation beneath your feet. I own this house. I am the bank. The absolute devastation that washed over his face was profound. His knees visibly buckled, forcing him to lean heavily against the wooden porch railing just to stay upright. You just sat down with an escrow agent and explicitly signed a legally binding contract to sell a massive piece of real estate that you do not own. I delivered the final crushing blow. You forged documents to claim ownership of an asset that belongs to a federal corporate entity, and you willingly accepted a $120,000 wire transfer across state lines for a fraudulent sale. I turned my attention away from my brother's crumbling reality and locked eyes with Shelby. She was frantically backing away toward the porch stairs, trying to distance herself from the radioactive mess she had willingly married into. But she was not an innocent bystander, and I was not going to let her play the victim today. Do you remember the frozen bank accounts at the hospital last week? I asked her, my voice dropping to a low and conversational tone that carried perfectly across the quiet lawn. You thought I simply locked you out of our mother's retirement fund, using my corporate credentials just to be petty. But that was not my freeze, Shelby. That was an official freeze initiated by the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Financial Crimes Unit. Shelby stopped moving entirely. Her perfectly manicured hands began to tremble at her sides. As an investigator, I do not just freeze accounts on a whim, I explained, taking a deliberate step toward her. I audited the money you have been siphoning from my mother for the past 2 years. You did not just spend it on designer bags and luxury vacations. You funneled those stolen funds directly through a fake billing company you set up to launder money for a massive medical insurance fraud ring you have been running out of your previous employer's office. You mixed my mother's clean retirement money with highly illegal, federally tracked stolen assets. Agent Reynolds stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. The sharp metallic clinking sound cut through the warm afternoon air like a knife. Signing away my house using a forged will is felony real estate fraud, I stated, stepping back to let the federal agents do exactly what they came to do. But laundering money for an insurance fraud ring makes this a massive federal racketeering case. The local police officers moved in seamlessly alongside Agent Reynolds. They grabbed Shelby by the arms, spinning her around and aggressively securing the handcuffs around her wrists. She did not fight back. She completely collapsed into a sobbing, hysterical mess, her designer dress dragging against the brick patio as the officers marched her toward the waiting police cruisers. Marcus watched his wife being taken away, his entire world completely obliterated in a matter of minutes. He fell hard onto his knees on the front porch, the sharp bricks tearing right through the fabric of his expensive suit pants. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his face, his hands clasped together in a pathetic and desperate plea. "Chloe, please," he sobbed, his voice cracking with absolute terror. "I am your brother. Please do not let them do this to me. I will give everything back. I am so sorry." I looked down at the man who had stolen 10 years of my life. I felt absolutely nothing, no anger, no pity, just a profound and quiet emptiness. I did not say a single word to him. I simply turned my back, stepped over his trembling legs, and walked through the grand front doors of my house to bring my mother inside. Sometimes blood does not make you family, and your breaking point is exactly where you find your power. Have you ever had to be ruthless to save the people you love? Tell me in the comments. Do not forget to like and subscribe.